All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 1971, a man by the name of Ray Tomlinson, working at ARPANET, began sending the first messages from one computer to another that you could roughly call something that we now recognize as email. I'll just say there is a lot that is murky in this story, including the date. So late 1971 is when Tomlinson was a computer programmer working with the ARPANET network, which is the precursor to the modern internet. And as we'll see, his memory is kind of fuzzy about this story, kind of lovably fuzzy around this story. So he doesn't know the exact date or the exact details, so we don't have to sweat the exact date. We'll get into it. But Tomlinson was playing around trying to send messages across ARPANET, and he was also starting to include addresses that had the @ sign, which would allow you to distinguish who was sending and at what organization. So yeah, we can see that this is basically something resembling modern email. And it all sort of came together somewhat haphazardly. A couple years later, there was this internal report that read, quote, "It just happened, and its early history has seemed more like the discovery of a natural phenomenon than deliberate development of a new technology." So super interesting to think about how this came together and obviously how it changed everything. Here to talk, I was going to say not digitally, but we're on Zoom. But at least it's a little more than email, right?
Yeah, sure.
But here together to talk
about
the early days of email are, as always, Nicole Hemmer Nicole Hemmer at vanderbilt.edu and Kelly Carter Jackson at wellesley.edu.
Hello, Jody.
Hello.
Hey there.
So, yeah, I'm sure that people who really know this history were in my intro, even though I was trying to couch how a lot of this was murky. They were like, they're listening and they're like, well, technically it wasn't the first thing. There was this thing at UCLA and Stanford and ARPANET came. So, I don't know. Is there anything else we want to add in terms of details about the timeline here or what was being developed and maybe what ARPANET is and kind of why that seems to often be credited as the cutting edge of this kind of technology?
Well, can I say that I can't remember where I was. It must have been a conference. I know I was at MIT. And it was the guy who claims to be the inventor of email. His name is Shiva, and I'm probably pronouncing his last name wrong, but Ayadari. His email address is like actually inventorofemail@inventorofemail.com or something really silly like that. But I mean, this is a unique story in that for the most part, people really credit Ray Tomlinson as being the inventor of email. But because there's not a lot of fixed dates and stamps on this, it is a little murky territory in the digital world.
In part because ARPANET and what they were creating looks very different from the internet that we now know. I mean, this is 20 to 30 years before the first web browser. It's at a time when the idea behind ARPANET was that you could have these computers in discrete locations that would be connected on this decentralized network. And this comes out of the military. It comes out of the Cold War, where the idea is in an age of nuclear weapons, when entire cities can be destroyed, you have to have decentralized modes of communication. So this really was about trying to figure out how to get computers to talk to one another. But it is also like kind of banal in that way that like office communication is banal.
Yeah.
So these emails, like the very first stage of it is, I want to leave a note for somebody who also works at this computer, but a note that like nobody else can read, so that it's private. And that's kind of the first. Well, it's at least the first electronic mail, if not quite what we would know as email, because you have to be at the same computer. Yeah. But it was just a way that, like, phone calls are more difficult because it requires somebody to pick up the phone. It often requires an assistant to take down the message. So this is just an easier way to communicate. And that's really the origin story of email, just like finding easier ways.
But was it easier, though? Because the first email takes like an hour to send 2 letters.
Well, this this isn't what Tomlinson's up to, but a couple years earlier than the moment than the winter of 1971, there was the first attempts at UCLA and Stanford to send a message from one computer to another, which is slightly different than sending an electronic message across a network. It's just sort of directly computer to computer. But yes, Kelly, like the message they chose to send was the word login, Login. And the computers crashed after the first 2 letters, LO. But I mean, obviously no one was thinking, oh, this is a momentous thing. And, it's mostly just we're playing around with technology. And it's like, it doesn't work, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And then the first time it works happens to be groundbreaking and history making, but no one realized at the time they're just playing around. But Nikki, I love this idea that a lot of it was just trying to sort of solve stuff that happens inside an office. And I wonder if when the first time someone was like, this meeting could have just been an email, and then eventually we started saying, well, this email could have just been a meeting, or
or a phone call.
Exactly. And so this I guess ties into the fact that, as I mentioned in the intro, Tomlinson himself doesn't really. People ask him all the time, what was the first email message you sent? What was it? And he basically doesn't remember.
Well, and I think that gets at how mundane it was, and how it really was about just trying to use this technology to find a new way to make life just a little bit easier. But it isn't. He isn't necessarily envisioning creating this system that allows you to talk across oceans, and something that's going to be in everybody's home, or in everybody's pocket. Like this idea that email would become, for many people, probably their primary form of communication with other human beings is not exactly what they're thinking about when they're developing ARPANET, which is at the time like this military technology. It's not necessarily understood as this thing that's going to revolutionize not just the military and not just business, but like human communication. So we look back and we see it as this transformative moment, but he's thinking, I can send a message over here. That's a little bit easier. Or like this military base can send a message over to that university and we'll have solved a problem of the nuclear age.
It's funny to me, though, because Tomlinson also says something that I think is so true. He's like, there's no really good way to send a message to someone when they're not there. So, I think about sending someone a voicemail. I hardly ever check my voicemail. Or when we think about the pain of checking email, or just having to respond to something outside of the time in which that communication is being generated, is really hard. It shouldn't be, but it does feel burdensome in a way that we can't seem to get around.
I also think there's something about the nature of the kind of technological change that's happening. The folks who are talking about this a couple of years later are talking about, as you said in the introduction, Jody, that it felt so natural. It felt like a discovery rather than this major technological leap forward. This is happening around the same time as the moon landing. It's the kinds of scientific innovations, the nuclear bomb, the moon landing, space travel, these kinds of things felt in a way almost supernatural or technological rather than natural. And this just felt like, we're just finding an easier way to communicate. So it doesn't have that kind of momentous feel to it.
Yeah. Yeah. So when he's been asked, I mentioned that, I love that it's like an official ARPA report includes the phrase, quote, "it just happened," right? That's the record. The official government record is "it just happened." But then when Tomlinson has been asked kind of what do you think the test messages were, he's like, they were entirely forgettable. His best guess is that it's QWERTYOP, like the run of letters across the top of a keyboard is probably just kind of what he was doing, because he was just like punching out some letters, hitting send, going to another computer and seeing if it was in the inbox there. And, like I said, it was probably didn't work. And then one time it worked, and that was the first email. But Nikki, your point about this like moment of technological innovation, it is kind of amazing how quickly it does seem to evolve in these first few years. Like, there's reporting that in 1976, just a few years later, Queen Elizabeth is the first head of state to use email. She tried out ARPANET's messaging system. And then Jimmy Carter's campaign in 1976 as well also like had two computers on his traveling jet and apparently used, left messages for each other and checked in. And also in this time, and I find this really kind of interesting, there was a push to have the post office kind of embrace electronic mail. I mean, obviously, all this is coming out of the language and the sort of thinking of the post office and sort of the way that other mail worked. But they were providing contracts to the USPS to be the sort of like governing organization for electronic mail, which is just a very interesting way of thinking about it.
But it's in the 1970s and not the 1870s. So the idea is not that the government is going to run this new form of communication or subsidize it or make it freely available or a public good, but it will remain in private hands.
Right. Even though it was a government subsidized program that sort of did all the innovation around it. And we've talked about that a ton, about how you get all these university programs that do, and research, especially in this era, the 60s and 70s, get these research grants and do this innovation and push things forward, and then it works its way into the private sphere.
Do you guys remember when you got your first email address? Like, I remember specifically in high school. No, scratch that. Middle school. It was probably 8th grade, where it was like, oh, everybody's getting email addresses. What's your email address going to be? And it was always like Hotmail or AOL or stuff that nobody uses anymore. But like, I don't know, that I felt like at that moment, though, you're sort of being ushered into this technological community of being able to communicate in this way that felt very advanced. I mean, things like Messenger were so cool.
I remember using it a little bit in college, but even in college, I checked my email once every week or two. We didn't have internet in the dorm rooms, I think, the first few years, or maybe I didn't have a computer. And so you had to go down to the computer lab to check it. And so it just wasn't present in the same way that it would be later on. I think I was a slow adopter of email.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, I don't know, maybe this is just anyone who, anyone thinks that their life was lived across sort of momentous change. But I do think we're all roughly the same age. I do think we slightly straddle this sort of shift in the internet from this moment where, I mean, Nikki, to your point, it was something that felt like another tool and how wonderful and open and democratized and a sort of agent for change it could be. And then over the course of my lifetime, I think it's, has transitioned to more kind of like another task, another thing to check and a burden, right? And I mean, there's all sorts of people way smarter than me. Like, we should have had Doug Rushkoff on for this conversation. But, he's someone who talks so much about how the promise of the early internet has disappeared, and the idea that the early internet was this democratizing force and this place where you could hack in the largest sense of the word, and create your own reality and create your own communities and all that stuff. And now it just feels like more of an imposition or a burden or whatever. Yeah.
Or a danger, right? Yeah. I mean, it would be interesting to hear listeners weigh in on this, but the idea of techno-utopianism, which I think persisted well into the 2010s with the Arab Spring, with the Obama administration, which really innovated with the internet and campaigning and tying it to small d democracy and, upbeat liberal populism. By the mid-2010s, people were like, wait a second. What Pandora's box have we opened? And people became much more techno-pessimistic. I mean, you see it in the debates around social media, but there has been a pretty significant heel turn on whether or not this is good or bad.
Because a lot of, I don't know about y'all, but email for me is like whack-a-mole. I'm just trying to clear out my mailbox. And the fact that, there's a study that said people spend 30 to 40 minutes of an hour just cleaning up email or responding to email or, the dreaded reply all. There's all of these things that that have just become so burdensome or so toxic in the way that we have to navigate our workspaces, that even now that people are on Slack, that's like a new, I think, revised way of doing email. It's still having to check or having to review or having to respond to something. You're constantly engaged.
This has also led to Reply All, which was the recently departed podcast about the internet. Innovated and I think they created Email Debt Forgiveness Day, November 30th. So you've missed it for this year. Or no, you might still have one.
Yeah,
you can do it still. November 30th is Email Debt Forgiveness Day. And that is the day when you are anything that you have been too anxious to respond to or you've forgotten to respond to, you can send an email on that day just pretending like 6 months haven't passed, pretending like you did not drop the ball a million years ago, and you can tackle those email inboxes that for all of us, I think, are a heavy burden to carry throughout the year.
Gosh.
Totally. Yeah, and it is like, every once in a while, I feel like I meet someone, and I'm not wired this way, but who has this like very zen and I think very healthy approach to email, and just where they're just like, they just don't sweat it, and they're just like, no, I don't work for my email. My email works for me. Like it's just sort of like, obvious to them, but it's and I'm like, right. Like I don't have. It's not an obligation. It shouldn't be like this. Should be a thing that works for me.
Did you see those emails? Like it'll be in someone's signature. Like I reply to emails on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or I do not reply to emails over the weekend, or
or like if I don't reply to this email, don't take it personal. I'm just living my life. But as we wrap up, though, Kelly, you mentioned one thing about sort of getting your first email address, and it made me think of something that I've always sort of wondered about. But like every once in a while, you still encounter someone who has a like at hotmail.com or at yahoo.com. And my theory is that is either indicates that you're like woefully behind the times and out of it, or it's like the biggest flex in the world. Like you know, and I feel like sometimes like I'll like get a contact for like a really, really famous person, and it's like at hotmail.com, and it just shows like I'm not gonna change my email for you. Like you adjust to me. You're gonna email me at Hotmail.
Hotmail I feel like is the email that I give for spam, or the email that I give when I'm like trying to just get a 10% discount and I don't want to give my real email address.
All right. Well, we have an email address, thisdaypod@gmail.com. Maybe we should register it at hotmail.com as well. But people
just
can get in touch, send us emails. It can be anything. It can be something thoughtful, or it can just be QWERTYOP, whatever you want. But that brings us to the end of the show. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
I'm just going to say it. This episode could have been an email.
It's true. Could have been a newsletter. Could have been a Substack.
Oh, man. Funny.
Radiotopia.